Welcome to Indications and Warnings with Alan Brewer. Indications and Warnings is privileged to have with us today David Kirichenko, who is an American Ukrainian journalist and associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. David has been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. He's covered major battles such as the siege of Bakhmut, the fight for Chasiv Yar. His analysis and reporting have been featured in the Atlantic Council, Center for European Policy Analysis, the Modern Warfare Institute at West Point, among other outlets. You can also find David's reporting at Euromaidan Press. In February 2024, David Kirichenko produced a report that gave insight into the world's first cyber war in a paper entitled Lessons from the First Cyber Warfare: How Supporting Ukraine on the Digital Battlefield Can Help Improve the United Kingdom's Online Resilience. This paper was produced by the Henry Jackson Society, and David presented it in an event at the House of Commons on February 20, 2024. And we are lucky to have David with us for about an hour to talk about lessons of the cyber war and to focus on drone warfare. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
It so happens that you and I are talking the day following Russia's largest attack of the war using both missiles and drones. I think from the reports I've seen, over 450 drones, quite possibly, aimed all across the country, as many as 18 missiles. You have friends and family in Ukraine. Have you been in touch with them today?
Yeah, I mean, of course, reached out, checked in on how they're doing and how they're managing with the constant attacks across cities. So, yeah, certainly have family and friends in Kyiv and Western Ukraine and Southern Ukraine and near the front lines as well. And to one extent, people are quite used to the constant air raid alerts, the sirens, the bombings, but of course, I don't think you quite get used to when the missiles hit and kill civilians, but then people are dealing with that fallout. I don't think any human gets used to that, or it's always difficult managing that type of news. And of course, I think people are tired, but they understand that if you give in now and you lose the will to fight, you will only invite more aggression, and that there'll be only worse things to come. And the Ukrainian people know that regardless of the pain that they're facing now, we must fight on.
Typically, Ukrainians describe their experience, citizens, after these massive assaults by the Russians in a very understated way. I was speaking to a friend in Kyiv earlier today, and he described the night as loud. This is a typical understatement of Ukrainians, don't you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, and they certainly have an interesting type of humor and way of communicating. And so, a journalist may reach out to someone in Ukraine and ask for a comment on an operation, and he's just going to get a simple response like, it was good, it was nice.
Right.
And, it's not very descriptive, and often Westerners may be surprised at some of those reactions, but it's quite typical from a Ukrainian.
Yeah. It's been, I think, very difficult to get Americans in particular, and a lot of citizens in Western democracies to gain an understanding of this war, especially its existential aspect. Do you think this is as true today as it was when you arrived in 2022?
Yes, but I think that the answer should be nuanced. Um, I think Western understanding of Ukraine has progressed in several stages. I mean, if you look back, and even when Ukraine was vying for its independence in 1991, around that time, you had George Bush Sr. come to Kyiv and gave the Chicken Kyiv speech and was telling the Ukrainians that they need to kind of fall back in line, and misread the like what Ukrainians wanted. And yeah, the same trend continued for decades, really. I mean, you had each US president think that they could manage Russia and build a partnership with Russia. And so you had George Bush in the 2000s talking with Putin, saying something like, "Oh, I looked into his eyes or his soul and saw a good person." And then you had Obama attempt to do a reset with relations with Russia, and then you had the mishap of Hillary Clinton and Lavrov pressing the red button that wasn't working, and Obama treated Ukraine like it was not a priority, and his team made that very clear. And when you think about that 2012 debate between Romney and Obama told Romney to stop trying to like drag us back into the Cold War era of considering Russia to be one of our leading threats. And so Obama and Biden under as a VP, like when you think in 2016 when Ukrainian intelligence led a raid on Crimea to attack Russian helicopters, Biden told the Ukrainians to not provoke Moscow and to stop doing these types of operations. The leader of Ukraine's defense intelligence was sacked, and trying to box the Ukrainians and like doing everything that could be done to appease the Russians. And so in 2014, it was the first wake-up call where a lot of Western academics, people began to realize of like, okay, Ukraine is under attack, and Russia has like larger ambitions at play of their desires, and people began to connect some of the pieces together and start to focus on like, okay, what is the Ukrainian perspective? Like, should we even spell cities, Ukrainian cities, in Russian English? And we started to see some of this movement, but granted, the real thrust or progression of understanding in the West came after 2022, and I think there was a big shock. But of course, I think we're reverting to the mean to a certain degree. Even when you think about journalists, and so many of the journalists, even after 2014, when we're reporting on Ukraine, were stationed in press bureaus in Moscow, and they come down to Ukraine, get a quick story, then go back to Moscow. And our understanding of Ukraine is dominated in the West by this like Russo-centric lens. And of course, there's like, you can go much deeper into that, whether it's like, okay, Ukrainian studies, why there are so few programs. And if there are, sometimes they're grouped under Eurasian studies, Russian studies. And even in these last few months, like I've been writing articles and doing reporting on Ukrainian intelligence and trying to find an expert in the West on Ukrainian intelligence versus trying to find an expert on Russian intelligence. You will find dozens of experts who know Russian intelligence, know their types of operations. But I mean, anyone off the top of your head, or just go on Google and try to find who's an actual expert on Ukrainian intelligence. Whereas the CIA, the FSB, everyone's always surprised at what Ukrainian intelligence is up to and doing. We don't have a good understanding of Ukraine, their willpower, what they're thinking, how they conduct these operations, and we approach Russia, we approach Ukraine with a very flawed understanding. And of course, credit where credit is due. Like, so much progress has been made since 2022. But then I go, what is it? This morning I read like stupid headlines of Ukraine's dirty fight is just getting started. Something along the lines in the Washington Post, where
I saw that same headline. It stopped me in my tracks. and precisely because of the word dirty warfare. Now, I guess what the headline writer was trying to get at is, I don't know, something along the lines of unconventional warfare or unconventional drone warfare like Operation Spiderweb. But the average reader of that headline is going to take away a much different opinion. It is one of the worst headlines I've seen, and there have been a lot of bad headlines in the course of this war.
Yeah, I mean, but even look at the sense of agency that we assign to Russia versus assigned to Ukraine. Like when the Ukrainians fight back, it's like, oh wow, unprecedented. Ukraine's rewriting warfare, or all these Ukrainian cities are under attack or going to collapse, or Russia retaliates for something. And we approach it from this like lens of what Moscow's thinking. And my friend JP Lindsay, one of his talks recently said, for months we heard about Pokrovsk was doomed and it was bound to fall at any point. But look, the Ukrainians are still holding the line there. So why aren't we praising Ukraine for holding the line when everyone was saying that all hope was lost? That part of the front was collapsing, but Ukraine is holding out there, and we're not like, why aren't we giving the Ukrainians praise and so focused on what Moscow thinks, and promoting that narrative? And so even within the Western media, there's just still such a strong bias and anchor for like, we build an understanding and we work backwards from what Moscow thinks, what Moscow wants. That's why you have all these, academics in the West that just don't understand Ukraine, and you have so many Cold War era scholars leading the discourse. And so you have guys like Biden and, his pals in academia that are very out of touch with the times, like writing all these op-eds and having such strong influence in the informational discourse about what's going on. And the framework that they apply is like nothing has really changed about the Cold War. We need to respect Russia. We need to respect their nuclear arsenal and respect their legitimate security concerns. But it's never, few stop and ask, like, okay, what are Russia's actual security concerns? I think it was McCain that said this is a mafia that has a gas station, a mafia state with a gas station. You just have a mafia and a kleptocracy running the Russian state, stealing everything that they can, and then they use their nuclear arsenal to threaten everyone. Yep. From intervening within it. And why is the question of why is everyone in Eastern Europe trying to get as far away from Russia as possible and join NATO? Like, what about the will of those people? Do you at any point in the future, if there's a dictator that's going around and demanding to take territory or use the threat of nuclear weapons to stop people from intervening, does that mean that we just give dictators endless authority to go in and normalize using military force to rewrite borders? I mean, that's how, the world order or whatever's left of it will just continue to unravel and unravel until you get to a breaking point.
Well, of course, that approach was supposed to have been stopped at the end of World War II. As I have tried to come to grips with the war and understand more of Ukrainian history, and having conducted some interviews, really appeasement of Russia predated Obama's appeasement of Russia, so predated Putin's annexation of Crimea and building up the war in the Donbass. I think American appeasement of Russia goes all the way back to Ukraine's independence in 1991. There's a good part of the Budapest Memorandum and the negotiations surrounding its writing that is nothing other than appeasement. I don't know about your views on that.
of course, I mean, the Ukrainian leadership, even at that time, understood that that was a deterrent against future aggression. And Russia's first democratically elected president, Boris Yeltsin, said he reserved the right um, to re-examine the borders of especially places like Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And so the Russian leadership, when they were thinking, okay, how do we build out our new worldview, they were really focused on building an ideology centered around Russian imperialism and nationalism against their neighboring states. And so Russia never wanted to get rid of its policies towards Ukraine. And in 1994, the Russian special forces attempted an operation to go into Crimea. And in 2003, you had the Tula Islands standoff where the Russians went and were threatening the Ukrainians, and we almost had an armed conflict breakout there, and Ukraine ended up signing an agreement with the Russians and sharing the Azov Sea, and Ukraine's sovereignty definitely lost some standing after that dispute. And so the Russians knew what they were doing, and they wanted to continue chipping away for decades. And if you think about the Western leadership, yes, it was the Russians were pushing to ensure that the Ukrainians didn't maintain their nuclear weapons. And of course, there were some legitimate concerns in the West in terms of, if these former states of the Soviet Union with large nuclear arsenals couldn't afford to maintain the fleet, and the bad actors getting, their access on them, or their hands on them, that's not a good outcome. But certainly I don't think anyone was thinking of like, oh, the Soviet Union is gone, so we're going to live in permanent peace, and these countries don't need help building deterrence against the Russians. And if you even fast forward to the end of the 90s, when Putin supposedly planted a bomb in Moscow, killed hundreds of people, used that as pretext to launch a war in Chechnya, crushed the Chechnya. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people died over the wars in Chechnya, and then the West never said anything. So, I mean, that was also amongst the first signals for Putin that he gets to go with free reign and kill masses of people, and we didn't say anything. And once he saw the Orange Revolution in 2004 and how the Ukrainians rose up and wanted democracy, well, if the Ukrainians drift towards Europe and their standard of living improves greatly, why won't the Russian people look at Ukraine and be like, wow, if they're so prosperous and free, why can't that be us? And they would go and take out Putin. So Russia's foreign policy became very aggressive after 2004. And by 2008, you had the invasion of Georgia. Also, nothing was done about that. And, it continued growing from there, and, like a cancer. And, without intervening, it's just going to grow and expand. And by the end, it's going to be much harder to combat it at that point.
Yeah.
Oh, and last point is, one of the main points of propaganda for Russia or Russian enthusiasts is, the U.S. somehow had a hand in the protests in late 2013 and 2014. But if you actually understood in detail what happened, you actually had Western leaders going to the leaders of the protest, telling them that you need to just sign an agreement with Yanukovych's government and not demand for his removal and find a compromise. And trying to support the pro-Russian government. You even had the current Polish foreign minister meeting with the leaders of the protest, saying that you all are going to be killed if you don't go and sign this deal. Yeah. So there was immense pressure by Western leaders not to encourage the protesters and their demands, but to go back and negotiate and leave the government in place that is extremely corrupt, was shooting and killing its own people. That whole narrative was a whole big lie. And again, Western leaders did not understand, what the Ukrainians were fighting for and what they wanted.
Yeah. Well, the Russian narrative, Russian misinformation, disinformation, for example, calling the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity a coup, initiated by the United States or by NATO. Nothing could be further from the truth. Well, David, because you spend so much time on the front lines, you are a frontline war journalist, and to get to drone warfare. As I've thought about this war, I think about Russia having greater manpower and firepower, which they do. But I think of Ukraine as having more brain power and willpower. And it's drones that have become the big equalizer. But there is a real race going on between Ukraine and Russia to innovate new drone technology and to use it for advantage on the front lines. In this race, who's winning right now?
I would say certainly in the past year or past few months, it's changed drastically. I think for years Ukraine was ahead and keeping their advantage up, and I think Russia has demonstrated that they have the ability to catch up in some areas and even lead. So one being fiber optics. Russia clearly has a lead there right now, and in general, even in the drone production and building out of some of these drone fleets, it's not the Russians by themselves working on this. It's the Iranians, it's the Chinese. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have Chinese industry giving so much supply, and you have, Zelensky said, Chinese representatives overseeing some of those like production lines in China. You have the Iranians helping the Russians build Shahed drone factories in Russian bolts. Yep. I mean, this modern axis of evil is learning. I mean, the North Koreans within a few months their missile trajectories when at first were way off, and then they became incredibly precise after a few months. They started to learn how to charge, and you're not going to charge en masse, but you break up into small groups, and even learning how to combat drones. And the North Koreans started to learn what drone fear is like, and that allowed the North Koreans committing those assaults allowed the Russian forces to get a break, and it's also helping them potentially with this offensive in Sumy region in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians, I think what Ukrainian commentators now are talking a lot about is there's going to be limitations to having so much of innovation being driven by like volunteers and workshops across Ukraine. At some point, you do need to standardize and get a lot more resources around some of these production lines and focusing military tech efforts. And I think Ukraine is set to reach around 5 million drones produced. And, if some of the variables, fall into place, they could end up producing more. But Ukrainian drone manufacturers are also really struggling with not having enough stable orders and being able to invest into R&D. So now there's a lot more chatter around exporting Ukrainian weaponry abroad, being able to get contracts, get more stable funding in. Ukraine really needs more of that money. And so sometimes when I'm reading about Western countries like wanting to invest money, build out some of these drones, which may or may not perform in the battlefield. I mean, one Ukrainian soldier I talked with the other week told me about the US Switchblade and supposedly having some of the AI capabilities, but on several flights that they took it out, it completely missed its target and was ineffective. So some of those Western drones that they've been testing just have not performed at all. And you really need a lot more investment flowing into Ukrainian drone manufacturers and producers doing more R&D. And the Ukrainians are if you invest into Ukraine, the Ukrainians, they're communicating in the shortest amount of time with soldiers on the front, being able to get feedback, make those tweaks and get those weapons right back out onto the front. And so it's been promising that, especially countries like Denmark, they've invested a lot of money into Ukraine's domestic arms production. And, the Russians, backed by China, North Korea, Iran, you have this deepening axis of evil that's supporting Russia's technological advancements. And the Russians aren't necessarily trying to build like very sophisticated drone technology, but I think the Russians, just like on the battlefield, believe in mass and being able to scale and overwhelming the Ukrainians. And even on certain parts of the front, soldiers have been telling me that they do already feel that the Russians have more drones, and they're trying to overwhelm their position. So, um, I think it's the Ukrainians are still somewhat ahead of the Russians, but of course the Russians have covered a lot of ground, have made a lot of effort to catch up, and Ukraine really needs to cut that gap within fiber optics. The Russians, China produces something like 80% of the world's fiber optics. And having that close partnership is going to benefit the Russians. And I think the Russians just have a lot more funds to spend. So the Russians can invest into a lot more fiber optic supply. Whereas, if you have Ukrainian volunteer producing some of these fiber optic drones, they're going to opt for some of the cheaper fiber optic, which might break or not produce as high of a quality as needed.
I have read where Ukraine uses a thinner fiber optic cable than the Russians. And it's important that you mentioned China. China has cut off export of Mavic drones to Ukraine, but continues to supply Russia with Mavic drones. And I think China is the world's largest producer of those Mavic drones. And it's simply important to understand that this access that Putin has drawn, so with Iran, with China, with North Korea, this has internationalized the war in a way that the West has been very slow to recognize and to assess as a very powerful, more and more closely knit alliance that is probably fighting its first war, and that the first war is in Ukraine. I like to say, David, that Ukraine's allies have tried everything except giving Ukraine all the military gear it needs to win to defeat Russia militarily, and I still believe that Ukraine could do that.
Well, there's also, I think in the Biden administration, they never thought about what we can do to help Ukraine win. It was merely, what can we do to ensure that Russia is not defeated? And so, but their primary concern is like, okay, if Russia's defeated, what happens to a defeated state and a rogue state with the nuclear arsenal? And so what they work towards is ensure Russia is not defeated, but that Ukraine doesn't collapse. So just bleed both sides out into like a forever war, and whatever happens after that. And so Trump's approach really hasn't changed much. It's not about maybe it's a continuation of Biden's policies to a certain degree of just like, let's just freeze the line and not ensure that the Russians overwhelm and win on the battlefield, but the Ukrainians don't make any victories or progress, and try to just get a ceasefire and freeze up the war, and just whatever happens in the future happens in the future.
Yeah.
And Europe, it's a damn shame that they woke up so late, only when they realized what was going on. But the writing was on the wall. It's like, imagine if a war with China broke out, even under the Biden administration would have abandoned Ukraine and ran to focus on the Asia Pacific, whereas the Europeans were slow rolling their aid, and just no words for Schultz, and just the how immoral and lack of principle he was as a leader, just to say of like, oh, I'll never give them the Taurus missiles.
I know.
And Ukraine really needed it. Oh, I'm scared to give them the tanks. Like, I want Biden. So they were just playing these games with one another. Like, I'm not going to be the first one. Somebody else give Ukraine. And, Ukraine needed a lot of these weapons, and they just slow rolled it out and let Ukraine lose a lot of his best soldiers in the fights around like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And so the price that Ukraine was paying for the lack of artillery shells and like Avdiivka was immense. And this intense drone war, a lot of it came out of pure necessity. Like, Ukraine was able to produce drones, but it couldn't produce these 155 milliliter shells that Ukraine really needed on the front line. And so yeah, it came out of just pure necessity. And so I would also caution that of course, Ukraine has changed so much of warfare, but there are certainly going to be lessons that we shouldn't over-index on, right? You're still going to need a lot of your traditional weaponry. And, I've spent time embedded with drone units on the front line, and both sides, amongst the most prioritized targets are drone pilots.
Yeah.
So if you can hunt and find the drone pilot and kill them, then you can neutralize the enemy's battlefield view for even a short time, which is very valuable. And if we think back to Ukraine's counteroffensive, the ideal scenario would have been to carpet bomb some of those fields and clear the mines and send the troops in. But Ukraine had so few resources. But even when it did, like when I was with the tank unit and they told me they got older German Leopard tanks and all the instructions were in German and some of the machines were broken and they had to fix them. But then trying to do combined arms with just dozens of very different types of systems and getting everything right is incredibly complex. And Ukraine, with the most difficult circumstances and variable needs to put everything together and make it a success. And then I remember when some US officials, I believe from the Wall Street Journal, commented that they know that Ukraine doesn't have what it needs to go on the counteroffensive, but they expect Ukrainian courage to carry them through, basically meaning that we know we set Ukraine up to fail, but they're courageous, let them go and fight with very little.
Yeah. As bad as the Biden policy of managing escalation was, I do think that what is emerging as the new administration's policies is even worse. David, I'd like you to take me into a drone unit on the front line. There are so many different kinds of drones. They have different missions. Drone warfare changes in the course of the day and through the night. So if you can, take me into a drone unit and lead me through what in the day that drone unit is doing.
Yeah, so you have, I spent time with groups that conduct reconnaissance missions. So they'll have, for example, one unit that I was with, they had a German vector drone. So probably worth around a couple $100,000, and is able to do a high quality capture of imagery. And the unit would go and deploy this drone. And in one scenario, we're in Chasiv Yar and the drone was flying around Bakhmut, and you can just see the whole city's been just completely decimated, and every building is ruined. And the drone flies around and you look for enemy movement. So a lot of the Russians were very quick to move on quads and motorcycles, and trying to figure out okay, they're moving from building to building and there's some sort of assembly of Russians going on and they're moving around and trying to figure out okay, is there a troop formation of around 20 soldiers that have gathered, and trying to figure out what are they planning, what are the troop formations up to, and is it worth calling, say, an artillery or some sort of strike on that position if we think they're amassing troops? But the Russians certainly adapt to battlefield conditions, right? Like especially in the past 6 to 8 months, where I think that in the news you see a lot. Well, it's true that Russia is running out of heavy armor and equipment, but some of the Ukrainian soldiers have told me that the Russians aren't low on heavy armor. They're just adapting their tactics to try to deal with the drones, and so they're moving very quickly with these motorcycles and ATVs through the battlefield. And so the reconnaissance drones also try to find like, okay, is there like a Russian air defense system that's parked or some high value target that we can go in and hit? And so try to map out some of these locations and targets, and then you send them to, depending on what you need to go after, you can send them to there's neighboring drone groups in the area that can send in like a heavy bomber drone. So like a vampire drone can fly in with the anti-tank mines and drop it on those positions, or give the coordinates to an artillery group and they'll fire. Other drone groups that I was with, it was like a small FPV drone, and typically they'll be handling those Russian assaults. So like the Russian soldiers will be running through a field and charging at us, and you're like right, and in some ways a stone's throw away from these soldiers. So these soldiers will be flying their FPV drones back and forth, loading them up with small explosives, and it's kind of like a video game. One of the drone pilots that I was with, he was so precise in his piloting of the drone. At one point, he dropped an explosive, and the Russian soldier was running and was able to land directly on his head and blow his head off.
Wow.
It was so precise, and that drone pilot was so skilled. And then eventually the Russians they get to an area, they start digging, and they try to dig and maybe get into like a destroyed building, and they start trying to create a dugout and start digging trench, and the drones are flying and killing them. But eventually the Russians will very slowly sacrifice a lot of men. They'll get into an area, start digging, and eventually by the third or fourth or 10th soldier, they'll have dug deep enough to get some cover. And then over a week or two, they'll keep sending more and more soldiers into that meat grinder, and they might establish a foothold in one building with 20 soldiers, and then from then on out, they'll assault the next street over, and like very gradually through this meat grinder assaults will make progress. And when they attack, they'll launch like glide bombs and fire everything that they have, while those soldiers try to advance street to street in those assaults. And you're hunting the enemy, and they're hunting you. And the soldiers, often when you're flying your drone, there's no guarantee that you fly back and you're not spotted. Of course, you check the area, you see that there's no Russian drones around so that they don't see you, but sometimes the Russian drone can follow your drone back to your base and identify where the drone operators are at, and then they can. So sometimes we'd come into the position and the area's already on fire, like the Russians hit it with artillery, and they identified where the drone pilots may be, and they try to drop everything that they got to hit him. Also spent time with the heavy bomber unit. So they have a vampire drone called, the Russians call it the Baba Yaga, named after a Slavic witch tale.
Right.
And typically the soldiers would load anti-tank mines and go and drop it on the Russian positions. And it's very loud and very scary. And the Russian soldiers panic very extensively when they hear that drone hovering above them in the darkness.
So that the Russians seem to be more scared of the Baba Yaga drone than almost any other that the Ukrainians deploy. But the Ukrainians have identified the Russian Lancet drone as one of the most effective drones the Russians use. Why are these two drones so feared, one by the Ukrainians, one by the Russians?
Well, having been and seen the Baba Yaga in person, and the Baba Yaga, and when it lands and like run out to soldiers, and you just hear it, and they quickly would load up anti-tank mines, and it is very loud, and typically it'll be out there in the nighttime hunting soldiers. And if you're a Russian infantryman and you're sitting in a dugout and you hear this really large drone hovering right above you, they typically get the rifles out and try to shoot and take it down, and then the drone releases an anti-tank mine, and it falls and just destroys the whole trench line, or that area that the Russian soldiers are hiding in. And if that anti-tank mine is like dropped in the right area where there may be ammunition stored, I've seen some very, very big explosions out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, but the Lancet are like when I was on the front line, and in one scenario, there was a Ukrainian tank. Like, they don't have Starlink, so I mean, the tank unit doesn't know where we're at. We're hiding in like a little dugout on the front line, with cover, and so you can't see where we're at. And the Ukrainian tank drove by, and it fired, and then it quickly like fled, but it fired near where we were hidden. And so at one point, there was around 8 Russian drones that flew into our area, like looking for that tank. And so I was just like sitting there frozen, because me and the drone pilots, we couldn't move. They can detect your heat signature. So if you climb out of the trench and you do something, so for a while you're just sitting there, and these drones, like the Lancet, can be very precise, and you hear these drones just hovering above you, looking for you to hunt you. And one little mistake, and then all of a sudden you have this very scary drone like flying directly at you, and it can hit you with like a very precise strike, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it's very scary when these drones are flying above you, hovering, looking for you, and then in an instant just drop down and fly right at you and hit you.
Now, the recon drones that are going out during the day, they also probably guide nighttime drone operations as well. I understand that one of the missions for nighttime drone operators is to lay minefields along anticipated routes of Russian advance, to lay minefields in the night where there was no minefield the day before. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, I mean, the operations never stop. So the drone reconnaissance will have like thermal or night vision, and they'll be flying out there throughout the night looking for targets. Throughout the day, you have Maverick drones patrolling the front, looking for targets. Like, you might have some Russian soldier crawling through the field, and the Ukrainians back at like the base will be monitoring every drone screen and looking for an anomaly, and then marking of like, okay, this is the point of interest. And so you mark these different coordinates, and the drone pilots, whether it's during the day or in the night, they'll fly their drones into that area, and they'll be like, okay, this looks like the Russians may have attempted to dig in and like bring some supplies out here, so we're going to go and drop an anti-tank mine on it and blow it up. And so they're constantly day and night flying their recon drones, Mavic drones, looking for targets, creating maps of coordinates. And then the drone groups, whether it's the small FPV drones or the larger bomber drones, depending on the type of target, they'll be flying back and forth, dropping bombs or anti-tank mines or other types of explosives. I've even seen bottles of liquid flammable dropped on a like trench position to burn out the Russian soldiers hiding in it.
Mm-hmm. One way to give viewers an idea of how intense drone warfare is, an idea of the ferocity. I think it was in one of your reports, David. I saw a figure that stopped me. One of the best Ukrainian drone units hitting something like 5,400 Russian targets in, I don't know if it was, I think I'm going to say in a day, but it's something like every 6.5 minutes, Ukrainian drones are striking a Russian target. It might be a soldier, it might be a tank, it might be a
Right.
ammo depot. Talk a little bit about that as a way to try to understand the ferocity of drone warfare.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of the better resourced and more most prolific Ukrainian drone units are, yeah, on average hitting targets every like 6 to 10 minutes. The Magyar's birds, yeah, it was around 7 minutes. They're hitting some sort of target, and so the interesting thing is that the Ukrainian government, they released that like marketplace idea where you collect points for each target hit, and then you can use that to get buy additional equipment that the drone unit needs. But the idea is to try to centralize all the data and encourage drone units to report their data and be able to see, one, not only the efficiency of like all the drone units, but also two, just you can get more and more data to determine of like, okay, what are all the targets being hit, and building data to get insights into like different parts of the front and the needs of these drone units, and you can start to see the trends like the efficiency, and build out a much better understanding of like what's going on out there. And so getting data, being able to understand these patterns is really important. I thought that was really interesting from the Ukrainian government. And they're also, I think, even Ukraine's Delta platform, or its attempts to standardize all these different data sources and video feeds into a centralized platform, and they're using Avengers AI to help speed up the kill chain of AI, like recommending targets to find. And I think we can expect, over time, the better that some of these data sources get, and like with AI helping identify potential targets, I think it's really important to get that kill chain speed up. So hypothetically, if on average your kill chain to send a drone out, find a target, call in, whether it's like a drone strike, artillery strike, say it's 10 minutes. Both sides are in a race to reduce that kill time speed, right, so that the faster you are that identifying a target and hitting it, I mean, that's going to save your life on the battlefield. So doing whatever you can to speed that process up is going to prove very crucial on the battlefield, and will become more and more important as time goes on.
And it would be a pretty important element for the success of Ukraine's drone wall of defense that has been talked about so much as the primary defense against any summer Russian offensive. Talk a little bit about what the drone wall of defense concept is. I think you were the first reporter to coin that phrase, David.
Yes, I mean, the idea is you try to get masses of drones, and of course, not every part of this drone wall is going to be equal. Some parts will be more resource, some will be a bit less resource, but I guess it just depends on the needs of the front line. But if, say, that the Russian objective is like, okay, we want to take all of Donetsk Oblast, and that's where the main thrust of the offensive is going to be, you can aggregate a significant percentage of your drones to a part of the front. And I mean, any time that the enemy tries to move, they're just going to be met with masses of these drones that hit anything that moves or any target. So it's really difficult to get, I mean, it's already very difficult to get any large formation of troops, but even these smaller groups of Russian troops that conduct these assaults will be hit, and it's just going to be very difficult to reach it. And so the Russians are experimenting with tactics, right? Like, it's very notable that they're using the motorcycle assaults, or sometimes even sending soldiers on crutches to use a bait for Ukrainian drones, and then use a mixture of glide bombs, and you're constantly trying to penetrate that drone wall. And if you can get some of these troops on the motorcycles to like break through and establish like a small position, you can throw the Ukrainian defense off balance. And the glide bomb is certainly a really, really difficult problem. And it's is continuing to figure out how to adapt, and also just even the trench lines. I think for years Ukraine made mistakes of building traditional trenches on many parts of the front line, but with drone warfare, you can't just build trenches in the open fields. I mean, like any soldier you put there will just be killed.
Right.
And then, the Russians with fiber optics, you don't need to have all fiber optics on the front. You can have a sufficient quantity that flies in targets, whether it's like electronic warfare systems or air defense systems, and hit those and clear the way for the rest of the assault, and for like radio controlled drones to be able to fly in and do their job.
Mhm.
And so those fiber optics and figuring out a solution is going to be important to ensure Ukraine's drone wall is as strong as possible. But for now, it's certainly holding well. And one of the main inputs or one of the main variables is certainly the quantity of drones. So Ukraine's going to need to continue scaling and building more and more drones to reinforce that drone wall. But really, you have the no man's land, or that gray zone, just continuously expanding. Whereas it might have grown from 5-10 kilometers on the front line, and it's continuing to expand, and you see the range of fiber optics expanding. You see the range of some of these, even some of the supposedly one of the Russian AI drones started hitting Ukrainian vehicles driving around like 40 kilometers from the front.
Yeah.
So you're going to see these danger zones continuously expanding further and further out, but especially within that concentrated 10 to 20 kilometer range, which is becoming more and more deadly.
Well, this is one aspect of, drones have changed every aspect of warfare, but one aspect in particular is logistics. It becomes harder and harder to deliver supplies to the front lines. And Chuck Farrar always talks about beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. That's what every soldier on the front line needs. Drones have changed logistics. They've complicated logistics for both Russia and Ukraine. And I wonder, I've seen ground lines of communication going towards the front, all under nets. So it would be like under the nets that you would find at a driving range or a batting range or something like that. Do those nets truly protect the logistical lines going to the front?
I mean, I don't think it truly protects them. I mean, it may have a certain, at least a limited benefit, but even, any sort of benefit, no matter how small, is important to try to protect your logistical lines. I mean, the Russians were able to hit Ukraine on the flanks in Kursk, and then use fiber optics to pretty much sever the supply lines into Kursk. And so you had Ukrainian soldiers on the front, when all those vehicles that are trying to get to the front to deliver supplies aren't making it, and then those soldiers in the trenches defending against those Russian assaults are running out of supplies. I mean, they had to pretty much start abandoning them and like running on foot and like losing those positions. And it made it very, very costly to have like forces out that deep and your supply lines extended. And the Russians just started closing the flank. Then Ukraine had that salient, and you had a very narrow road into Kursk, which became a prime target. So it made it very costly for Ukraine. And I mean, arguably, a lot of criticism is out there for Ukraine's military leadership for holding it far longer than, maybe they should have, and should have just retreated when, the Russians closed up the flanks and were devastating Ukrainian logistics with the fiber optics.
Right. Other aspects on the front that drones are changing. One of the most dangerous missions is now evacuating a wounded soldier from the front line. So wounded soldiers are spending longer on the front line before being taken back to a front line, medical point. stabilization point. It also means that soldiers are being rotated off the front line less frequently, so spending a longer time because it's so dangerous to make that rotation under the saturation of drones. Is that accurate also, David?
Yeah, I mean, even the drone units that I was with, I mean, the guys on the front line typically would rotate every few days and get out of position. But I mean, that duration continued expanding from 3 to 5 days to then 8 days, and now it's some of those soldiers are out there for 30 days, and the circumstances, are getting more and more, and getting the wounded out, and so you have a race to try to get ground robots or ground unmanned systems out there. But those are also very vulnerable targets for drones. Like, they're not, you can't just deploy these ground robots and they're safe. They're also just being hit by these drones. But of course, the more that you can reduce the risk to putting, say, a medic's life and trying to go out, but if you do, you're able to send out a ground robot, load the injured soldier, but there are also complications within that. What if the ground robot gets stuck in a position? What if the signal is jammed? So you need, they're already deploying fiber optic ground robots to try to help with that. But of course, fiber optics will slow down the speed typically. And it's making it very complicated. And there was also this race, and I think a lot of people were thinking that AI-enabled drones would start to dominate the battlefield much faster. But then we see this reverting to somewhat of a more traditional solution of not necessarily like advanced technology taking over, but just putting a wire onto a drone, and that's proliferating much faster across the battlefield.
Yeah. David, I know we have you for only a couple of more minutes. I appreciate all of the time you've given me here this afternoon. But I want to ask you very quickly, as a Ukrainian-American who watched this genocidal invasion by Russia unfold, how quickly did you decide you had to go to Ukraine? Did you feel you had any other choice?
Yeah, well, my father was born in Luhansk Oblast on the border with Donetsk Oblast. So a lot of my father's side of the family is from Donbass. So I actually would go to eastern Ukraine as a child and would spend time in Donetsk, Crimea, and much of my relatives are from Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and so they were there for the first days of Russia's initial invasion in 2014, and I actually went there in 2017, and of course it was very little compared to what's going on these days, but saw what was happening in 2017, and just the intense disinformation and I think very sloppy journalism and analysis, and it really motivated me from there on out to want to contribute and inform the world about Ukraine's perspective. So, I'd say even as a child, I knew that I would have a role to play, and of course, it goes very deep into my family story, from my family surviving the Holodomor, the genocide in the 1930s. My great-grandfather was executed by the Russians. My relatives fought in pretty much all of Russia's imperial wars, like the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, great-uncle that died in the Russo-Finnish War, family that fought on World War I, World War II, the Soviet-Afghan War. And we were punished for being Ukrainians and wanting to be a free people. And I think the deep trauma that Ukrainians carry, it lingers today, and it motivates so many Ukrainians to fight. And I think a lot of Ukrainians feel the need that you can't just sit back and watch them slaughter and kill our people like they've done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And from myself. Like even before the war, I was, writing and trying to do what I could to help Ukraine. And everything came together to be able to use, I think, my skills and my abilities to help support Ukraine. And the war broke out, and I knew that I couldn't just sit back and watch this war unfold from the TV, and that this is something that my ancestors and family have fought for centuries, and I knew that I had to go and do something and contribute.
Well, I want to thank you, David, for the time you've given us here on Indications of Warnings today. We've been speaking with David Kirichenko, who is a Ukrainian-American journalist, an associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He's reported from the front lines of Ukraine since 2022. You can find a lot of his reporting in the Euromaidan press, but we will also leave links and descriptions of how to find your reporting. David, I hope you can come back to Indications and Warnings. I feel as though this conversation is only the first of, I hope, many to come.
Of course, thank you for having me, and very much looking forward to continuing our relationship.
Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
And Slava.
Slava Nazi.
Smudge.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Cheers.